It was supposed to be the happiest chapter of our lives. After 35 years of marriage, raising 2 kids, and welcoming 3 beautiful grandchildren into the world, we'd finally done it. We built our dream home by the sea. We'd spent years saving for it, poring over every detail. And after all the sacrifices, we finally had what we wanted, a peaceful life together in a place that felt like paradise. We didn't sell our old house. It held too many memories, our kids' first steps, late nights sitting by the fireplace. Instead, I decided to renovate it with my own hands, planning to give it to our son. He and his girlfriend were thinking of getting married soon, and I wanted to give them a fresh start the same way we'd had ours. One morning, while I was taking down some shelves in the study, I noticed something unusual. Behind the tall, dusty bookcase that had been there for decades, the wall felt different. A small wooden panel that didn't match the rest. Curious, I pried it open. It wasn't easy. The screws had rusted over. But after some effort, the panel popped off, revealing a hollow space. Inside was a tin cookie box. I actually chuckled when I saw it. It was the kind of tin that held those old butter cookies my wife, Linda, used to love. She hadn't had them in years, but I could picture her sitting at the kitchen table as a young woman, enjoying them with coffee on a quiet morning. But when I opened it, I didn't find old keepsakes or forgotten treasures. Instead, there were letters, a stack of them, neatly folded, tied with a faded red ribbon. My chest tightened. The handwriting on the envelopes wasn't mine. It was delicate but unfamiliar. The first one I opened was dated back to the early 90s. The letter inside began with her name in a soft, reverent tone. Linda. As I read the first few lines, the reality of what I was looking at hit me. It was a love letter, not from me, but from someone else. The name at the bottom of the letter was Daniel, and I knew exactly who he was, her professor from university. The man she had once described as brilliant but distant. My mind felt like a radio stuck between static and screaming voices. I flipped through more of the letters, scanning phrases that pierced like needles through my chest. I'll never forget the way you smiled at me when the world felt too heavy. I loved you then, I love you still, and the one that finally made me sit down because my legs couldn't hold me anymore. I will carry your scent with me until my last breath. These weren't just words of fleeting infatuation. They were confessions of a lifelong obsession. The stack wasn't small. There must have been 60 letters, maybe more. Some of the ink was faded with age, while others were as sharp and fresh as if they'd been written yesterday. That's when I noticed one that stood out. The envelope was newer, the paper bright. I unfolded it, dreading what I'd find. The letter was dated 8 years ago. 8 years. It wasn't ancient history, it was recent. In it, he wrote about how grateful he was for her recent reply. He described her words like lifelines that kept him afloat. He described her laugh, her hair, her scent, as if it was all still alive in his mind. I felt like I was watching my entire life through a cracked window, shattered pieces distorting the memories. I thought back to 8 years ago. Our granddaughter Emma had just been born. I remembered Linda cradling her in her arms, telling me how happy she was that our family was growing. But somewhere, in some quiet corner of her mind, she'd been writing letters to a man who still loved her. My heart pounded in my chest as the weight of the truth settled in. This wasn't just a chapter from her past. It was woven into the very fabric of our lives. I gathered the letters and drove home, my hands trembling the entire way. The ocean breeze that usually brought me peace now felt suffocating. When I walked through the door, Linda was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. She turned and smiled at me like nothing had changed. I stood there for a moment, the box of letters in my hand. I wanted to pretend I didn't know. I wanted to rewind to the life we had before I'd opened that wall. But the truth was like a splinter in my mind, digging deeper with every second. Linda, I said, my voice unsteady. We need to talk. Her smile faded as she looked at me, and something shifted in her eyes, a flash of fear. I set the tin box on the table between us. She stared at it, then at me. She reached for it with shaking hands and opened the lid. When she saw the letters, her breath caught in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes. Please, she whispered. Let me explain. Her voice cracked, and in that moment, I saw the weight of guilt she'd been carrying for who knows how long. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, to make sense of it all. But instead, I felt hollow, too stunned to do anything but listen. Linda sat down, gripping the edge of the table, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Is it true?" I asked quietly. She nodded, tears spilling down her face. "How long?" she sobbed, pressing her hands to her face. "Since college. But it wasn't like you think, at least not always. It started when I was 20. He was my professor. I admired him, and somehow it turned into something else. And after we got married," she nodded again, unable to look at me. "I thought it was over. I thought I'd closed that chapter when I chose you. But he kept writing, and you kept answering. That was the part that shattered me." She reached across the table as if to touch my hand, but I pulled away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was stupid. I didn't know how to stop. And I didn't think it would hurt you if I never acted on it physically." "Linda," I said, my voice breaking, "you've been emotionally tied to this man for decades." The room was unbearably silent except for her quiet sobs. "I need time," I said finally, standing up. My legs felt like lead as I walked out the door and into the salt-tinged air. The life we'd built, the future we'd dreamed of, it all felt like a mirage. I sat in the sand, watching the waves roll in, the weight of her confession pressing down on me. How do you move forward when the person you trusted most has kept a part of her heart hidden away for someone else? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew that the tide always came in, no matter how much you try to stop it. I stayed outside for what felt like hours, watching the sky shift from a soft pink sunset to the cool darkness of night. The sound of the waves should have been calming, but nothing could settle the storm inside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tin of letters. Every word I'd read echoed in my mind, louder and more painful than the last. Eventually, I dragged myself back inside. The house was quiet, the lights dimmed. Linda was sitting in the living room, clutching one of the throw pillows like it was a lifeline. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes swollen and red from crying. "I didn't want it to happen like this," she said softly. I sat down across from her, leaving a wide space between us. "How else was it supposed to happen, Linda? You've been lying to me for, what, 30 years? 40? She winced but didn't look away. "I didn't lie about us. I love you. I've always loved you." I shook my head. "You don't get to say that. Not after what I found today." Her face crumpled, and for a second I felt something almost like pity, but it was quickly drowned out by the sheer weight of betrayal. "Tell me everything," I said finally. "I need to know the truth." Linda took a deep breath, like she was about to dive into something deep and dangerous. "It started when I was 20, she began. "You remember how much I wanted to go back to school after having James. I was so excited to be doing something for myself. And Daniel, he noticed me right away. He wasn't just a professor to me. He was magnetic in a way I didn't expect." I stayed silent, though I could feel anger bubbling under the surface of my skin. At first, it was harmless. I talked to him after class. He made me feel smart, interesting, like I was more than just a young mom trying to juggle a baby and a degree. And then one day, he gave me a note. "A note?" I repeated incredulously. She nodded. "It was innocent at first, at least I thought so. He wrote about how he admired my strength, how he looked forward to our conversations. But over time, the notes got more personal. He'd talk about my smile, the way my hair caught the light. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. "And you let it happen." "I was young," she whispered, "and lonely in ways I didn't even realize. But I never meant to fall for him." "But you did." Linda nodded, wiping her eyes. "I was confused. I loved you, but Daniel was different. He made me feel seen in a way that scared me. We never crossed a physical line, but emotionally, I think we both knew what was happening." "That's not comforting," I muttered. "I know." She let out a shaky breath. "After I graduated, I cut it off. I chose you. I chose our family. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Why didn't you tell me when the letters started again?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Because I was ashamed. And because part of me liked hearing from him again, he'd tell me about his life, ask about mine. It was like stepping into a different world where I wasn't a mom or a wife. I was just me. And did you tell him you loved him? My voice cracked despite my efforts to hold it steady. Linda's silence was deafening. She didn't need to answer. I already knew. I stood up, pacing the room. Do you know what's the worst part of all this? I asked, my voice rising. It's not even the letters. It's the fact that you made me believe we had something real. And all the while, you've had this secret life, this Daniel in the background of everything. I never wanted it to be like this, she said again, helplessly. Well, it is. I rubbed a hand over my face, trying to think straight. God, Linda, do our kids know? Did they ever notice anything? No, she said quickly. It was never like that. I was careful. Careful. That word cut deeper than any other. I need to understand one thing, I said, turning to face her. Why did you keep answering him after all these years? What did you get from it that I couldn't give you? Linda's face crumpled again. It wasn't about you, she whispered. It was about me. I wasn't trying to replace you or hurt you. I don't know. I was selfish. I like feeling like someone else's fantasy. That's not an excuse, I said sharply. I know. We sat there in silence, the weight of everything hanging between us. There was so much I wanted to say, so many questions I didn't know how to ask. Finally, I stood up. I'm going to stay somewhere else tonight. Linda shot up from the couch. Please, don't leave like this. I can't be here right now, I said, grabbing my keys. Where will you go? Her voice was small, desperate. I don't know. I just need space. She didn't try to stop me again. I walked out into the night, the cool breeze hitting my face as I climbed into the car. I didn't have a plan. I just drove, letting the quiet hum of the road fill the void in my mind. After an hour, I found myself pulling into a small motel parking lot a few towns over. I checked in, barely registering the conversation with the clerk. The room was small and simple. A bed, a chair, and a window that overlooked the empty street below. I collapsed onto the mattress, staring at the ceiling. The reality of everything was finally catching up to me, and it was unbearable. I thought about the life we'd built, the family dinners, the vacations, the quiet mornings we'd spent together, and now all of it felt tainted. I wondered if I'd ever be able to look at Linda the same way again. Would I ever believe her again? Would I ever stop picturing those letters, the man who'd written them, and the version of Linda he'd carried in his heart for decades? Sleep didn't come that night, and when the sun rose, it didn't feel like a new day. It felt like the same nightmare continuing in the harsh light of morning. The next morning, I sat by the window of the small motel room, sipping terrible coffee from a styrofoam cup and staring blankly at the street below. People were going about their day, walking dogs, jogging, chatting with each other. Their lives seemed so normal, so untouched by the kind of devastation I was drowning in. It felt surreal, like I was somehow stuck in a different world. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't need to check to know who it was. Linda had called me 4 times since I left. I let each call ring out. She'd also sent texts, long paragraphs, some just a few words, all of them dripping with the same mix of guilt and desperation. Please come home. I can't fix this if you're not here. I love you. You, and only you. I'll do anything to make this right. I turned the screen over, unable to look at it anymore. Love. The word felt foreign now, like something abstract that had slipped through my fingers. Did it even mean the same thing to her as it did to me? By midday, I finally forced myself to leave the room. I didn't have a plan, just a restless energy that made it impossible to sit still. I drove aimlessly for a while, until I found myself at a familiar place, the little cafe we used to go to when the kids were young. Linda always ordered a chai latte and a blueberry scone. I don't know why I ended up there. It felt masochistic, really. But I ordered a coffee and sat near the window, letting the memories wash over me like waves. As I sat there, I replayed our entire relationship in my mind. The way we met at a mutual friend's barbecue when we were just teenagers. How she laughed at my terrible jokes and told me I had a terrible sense of humor, but liked me anyway. Our wedding day. the tiny, rundown apartment we lived in when James was born. Every milestone, every moment we'd weathered together. And yet, through all of it, there had been this invisible thread tying her to someone else. Someone I never saw coming. The thought filled me with an unbearable mixture of sadness and rage. What hurt the most wasn't even Daniel himself. It was the fact that she had nurtured a version of herself, however small, that belonged to someone else. And I never knew. I stayed at the cafe for over an hour, lost in thought. At some point, an older couple sat down near me, holding hands and laughing quietly over their shared dessert. I forced myself to look away. The image felt like a cruel reminder of everything I thought my life would always be. By the time I got back to the motel, I had made a decision. I couldn't keep hiding from this. If I didn't confront it head-on, the questions would eat me alive. I needed answers. Not just the ones Linda had given me, but everything. The missing pieces that kept me awake at night. So how did the one thing I never thought I'd do? I found Daniel's address. He wasn't hard to track down. His name popped up right away in an alumni directory from the university. He still lived in the same town, just a few miles from where it all began. As I stared at the screen, part of me hesitated. Was I really about to do this? But something in me snapped. I needed closure. I needed to know who this man was. The man who had haunted my marriage for decades. The drive was strangely calm. I expected my nerves to be shot, my heart racing. But there was only this eerie stillness inside me. When I pulled up to his house, I sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the modest brick home in front of me. The yard was well kept, the flower beds freshly mulched. It all looked so ordinary. I got out and walked to the front door, hesitating for only a second before knocking. It took a moment, but eventually the door opened. Daniel stood there, older than I'd expected, but unmistakably him. He looked like the kind of man who carried himself with quiet confidence. His hair was more gray than brown now, and he wore a simple sweater and jeans. His face shifted as he looked at me. Confusion at first, then recognition. He knew exactly who I was. "Robert," he said, almost like he'd been expecting this day to come. "I figured I might see you one day." His calmness almost sent me over the edge, but I held it together. "Can we talk?" I asked. Daniel nodded slowly and stepped aside. "Come in." The house was cozy but cluttered, filled with books, photographs, and mementos. I glanced at the pictures on the mantel. There were no wedding photos, no signs of a family. Just pictures of Daniel alone, sometimes with students or in front of lecture halls. It painted a stark contrast to everything Linda and I had built together. He gestured toward the couch, but I stayed standing. "I'm not here for small talk," I said. "I need answers." He nodded again, as though he understood exactly what I meant. "I'm not going to lie to you, Robert. You deserve the truth." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Did you ever see her? After college? In person?" He shook his head. "No, not once." I studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but he looked sincere. "Then why the hell did you keep writing?" My voice was sharp, accusing. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Because I couldn't let go. She was a light in my life when everything else felt dark. I know that sounds pathetic, but it's the truth. I never stopped loving her. But I also knew she chose you. She made her choice, and I accepted that, at least in the physical sense. But emotionally, I was selfish. I clung to the connection, no matter how one-sided it was." "She answered you," I shot back. "It wasn't one-sided." Daniel flinched at that, as if he'd tried to convince himself otherwise. "I know," he whispered. "I was wrong to pull her back in." "Wrong?" I laughed bitterly. "You helped ruin my marriage." "I didn't mean to," Daniel said quietly. "But I can't change what I did. And I'm sorry, for whatever it's worth." I stared at him for a long time, letting the weight of his apology settle. I wanted to hit him, to scream, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain I felt. But in that moment, all I felt was exhaustion. I turned toward the door. "I hope you live with this every day of your life." Daniel didn't try to stop me. As I walked out and slammed the door behind me, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly, but something close to clarity. This wasn't just his fault. Lynn had made her choices too. But the thing I finally understood was this. No apology, no explanation, no confession was ever going to fix what was broken. The only person who could decide what happened next was me. The drive back home felt longer than it should have, though I wasn't in any rush to get there. The sky was turning gray, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, rain had started to fall, a soft drizzle that matched the heaviness in my chest. When I walked into the house, Linda was sitting in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. She looked up when I came in, and for a moment we just stared at each other. She looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept since I left. "You went to see him, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded and took a seat across from her. "Yeah, I did." Her eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't look away. "What did he say?" "The truth," I replied. "He admitted to everything. He told me he never saw you in person after college, but the letters never stopped because he couldn't let go." Linda closed her eyes, the weight of my words sinking in. "I'm so sorry," she whispered for what felt like the 100th time. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "Linda, do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just hurt me. You tore apart everything I thought was real. Our entire life, it feels like it was built on a lie." She reached out again, and this time, I didn't pull away. Her hand was cold against mine. "It wasn't a lie," she said, her voice trembling. "I loved you. I still do." I stared at our hands, hers resting so gently on mine, and I wanted so badly to believe her. But there was a wall between us now, one I wasn't sure could ever come down. "I don't know if that's enough," I said softly. "I don't know if I can come back from this." Linda sobbed quietly, but I didn't move to comfort her. I was too tired, too broken. "Do you want to leave?" she asked after a long silence. "Is this the end?" I didn't answer right away. I'd been asking myself the same question over and over since I found those letters. Was this something we could rebuild? Or was it the kind of betrayal that leaves cracks too deep to repair? Finally, I spoke. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if we're going to try, things have to change." Linda nodded, desperate to hold on to even a thread of hope. "Anything," she said. "Tell me what you need." I took a deep breath, feeling the full weight of what I was about to say. "You need to tell the kids. Not everything, but enough. They deserve to know why things might change between us. I don't want them thinking I walked away for no reason." She hesitated, and I saw the fear in her eyes. But after a moment, she nodded again. "Okay, and no more secrets," I added. "Ever." "Never again," she promised. I pulled my hand away and stood up, pacing the kitchen. "Linda, if we try to fix this, I'm not going to be the same. I don't know how long it'll take for me to trust you again, or if I even can." "I'll wait as long as you need," she said. Her words hung in the air, and part of me wanted to believe them. But trust isn't something you can force. It's something that grows slowly, and only if the soil isn't poisoned. I didn't know if our soil was still fertile or if it was barren after everything she'd hidden. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur. We didn't tell the kids right away, not until I felt strong enough to have that conversation without breaking down. Linda and I tiptoed around each other in the house, unsure of how to act. There were moments when I caught her watching me, her eyes full of guilt and sadness. She wanted to reach for me, to pull me close, but I kept my distance. I started sleeping in the guest room. At night, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was awake too. I wondered if she was reading his letters in her mind, remembering the man who had loved her from afar. One morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes. Linda was in the kitchen, flipping them like she used to when the kids were little. It was such a painfully domestic scene that I almost laughed. She turned when she heard me, her eyes hopeful. "I thought I'd make breakfast," she said. "Just something normal." I sat down, unsure of how to respond. The pancakes tasted like memories, like the mornings we'd spent together before everything shattered. But no amount of syrup and butter could sweeten what had happened between us. We talked more after that. Small conversations at first, about the weather, about our granddaughter's upcoming birthday, about the renovations on the old house. Slowly, we started to have the bigger conversations too. I told her how the letters made me feel like a fool, like I'd been blind to something everyone else must have seen. She told me how scared she'd been to lose me, how the guilt had eaten away at her for years. One night, I asked her the hardest question of all. If I hadn't found those letters, would you have told me? She hesitated, and that was all the answer I needed. I don't know, she admitted finally. I wanted to, so many times, but I was terrified. That broke something in me all over again. Then you weren't just afraid of losing me. You were afraid of me knowing the truth. She nodded, and we both sat in that awful truth for a long time. Months passed. Slowly, things shifted, but they were never the same. I started going back to the old house to finish the renovations, needing the distance, needing to feel like I was building something from scratch, even if it was just drywall and paint. Eventually, we told the kids. I didn't give them all the details, but I told them enough. James and Anna were shocked, of course, but they handled it better than I expected. James hugged me for a long time afterward, and Anna asked if I was going to be okay. I told her the truth. I'm not sure, but I'm trying. The day we finally finished the old house was bittersweet. Our son was excited to move in, and I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. But as I stood in the empty living room, I felt the finality of it all. This was supposed to be a gift for him, a symbol of how Linda and I were building a legacy for our family together. Now it felt like something I'd done on my own. Linda came by later that day to see the finished house. She stood beside me, her hand brushing mine, but not quite holding it. We stared out the window at the backyard, where the swing set used to be when the kids were small. We've come so far, she said quietly, and lost so much along the way. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard. Yeah, I said finally, but I'm still here. Linda exhaled slowly, as though she'd been holding her breath for months. We didn't win or lose that day. There wasn't a clear victory or defeat. Just two people trying to figure out if love, once shattered, could ever be made whole again. Maybe it couldn't, but for the first time in a long while I felt something close to hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.